She lost everything in one signature until a man walked in from the storm and changed her destiny forever. Taken deep into the mountains, trapped between danger and mystery, Clara must ask herself, did she just escape death or walk straight into it? This story reminds us, strength is not about where you come from, but who you become when survival is the only choice. This channel tells powerful Western tales about cowboys, love on the frontier, family bonds, and the compassion between people. If you enjoy stories like this, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The scratch of Magistrate Miller's iron-nibbed pen sounded exactly like a rat gnawing through dry floorboards. Clara Vance sat rigid in the hard-backed wooden chair, her hands folded tightly in the lap of her black morning dress. She refused to let her fingers tremble, though the suffocating heat of the potbelly stove in the corner of the office was doing nothing to thaw the ice in her veins. Outside, the Wyoming sky was a bruised, heavy purple, promising a blizzard before nightfall. Inside, Clara's world was already being buried. $3,400, Miss Vance, Harlan Decker said. He didn't gloat. He didn't have to. The town's wealthiest land speculator stood by the frosted window, impeccably dressed in a tailored wool suit that cost more than most ranch hands made in a decade. He spoke with the smooth, reasonable cadence of a man who held all the cards. Your late father was an ambitious man, but ambition without capital is a dangerous game. These promissory notes are legally binding. Clara kept her chin level. My father never borrowed that much from you, Mr. Decker. He was an assayer. He knew the value of $1, and he despised debt. Grief clouds the mind, my dear, Decker sighed, a patronizing sound that made Clara's jaw ache from clenching it. The ledger does not lie. Under the Territorial Bonded Labor Act, the debt falls to the next of kin. I am offering you a generous arrangement. 10 years of service as a housekeeper and ledger clerk at the Cross Iron Ranch, and the debt is forgiven. It wasn't a generous arrangement. It was a death sentence. 10 years isolated at Decker's sprawling compound meant she would be entirely at his mercy, effectively an indentured servant, or worse. It was a thinly veiled maneuver to keep her under lock and key while he picked apart her father's remaining, seemingly worthless land claims in the Badlands. Sign the contract, Miss Vance, Magistrate Miller muttered, not meeting her eyes. He pushed the heavy parchment across the desk. Miller's palms were sweating. Decker owned the bank that held the magistrate's mortgage. The law in this town was whatever Harlan Decker could afford to buy. Clara stared at the line of ink waiting for her name. Her father had been found at the bottom of a ravine 3 weeks ago, his neck broken, his horse nowhere to be seen. An accident, the sheriff had ruled. Clara knew better, but knowing the truth and proving it were two very different things in a town built on corrupted silver and cattle money. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold wood of the penholder. She had no money, no family, and no options. Before her fingers could close around the pen, the heavy oak door of the magistrate's office didn't just open. It was violently shoved inward. A howling gust of freezing wind ripped into the stifling room, extinguishing the oil lamp on Miller's desk and sending a flurry of loose papers airborne. Clara gasped, twisting in her chair. He filled the doorframe. The man was a towering silhouette against the dying gray light of the storm. He stepped inside, pushing the door shut against the wind with a heavy, gloved hand, and the sudden quiet in the room was absolute. He brought the brutal wilderness in with him. The scent of sharp pine, ozone, and dried blood cut through the stale air. He wore a weather-beaten canvas duster over thick, raw wolf pelts. A battered Stetson was pulled low over his brow. but it couldn't hide the jagged, pale scar that slashed from his left cheekbone down into a dense, unkempt, dark beard. A massive, heavy-barreled Sharps rifle was slung across his broad back, resting there with lethal familiarity. Magistrate Miller swallowed audibly. "Office is closed, stranger. We're conducting private town business." The man didn't answer. He moved toward the desk, his boots leaving heavy, melting tracks of snow on the floorboards. Clara noticed a slight rhythmic limp in his stride, a testament to some old, brutal injury, but it didn't slow him down. It only made him seem more like an unrelenting force of nature. Harlan Decker stepped away from the window, his smooth facade cracking just a fraction. "Listen here, you vagrant. I don't know what hole you crawled out of, but you will turn around and—" The mountain man ignored him completely. He stopped in front of the desk, towering over the seated magistrate. He reached inside the heavy layers of his duster and pulled out a swollen, grease-stained leather sack. With a flick of his thick, scarred wrist, he upended it over the legal documents. A collective intake of breath echoed in the room. Clara's eyes went wide. Dozens of heavy, unrefined gold nuggets clattered against the oak desk, heavy and dull, accompanied by a cascade of fine, glittering dust. This wasn't bank-minted coin. This was raw earth blood, pulled directly from the veins of the mountains. It was a staggering amount of wealth, easily double what Decker was claiming. "Weigh it," the man commanded. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. It was the voice of a man who hadn't spoken to another human being in a very long time. Miller sat frozen, staring at the fortune scattered across his blotting paper. "What is the meaning of this?" Decker demanded, his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. He took a step forward, his hand drifting instinctively toward the lapel of his coat where he kept a derringer. "That is a private contract." The mountain man slowly turned his head. His eyes, a pale, startling ice blue, locked onto Decker. There was no anger in them, only a vast, terrifying emptiness that made the hairs on the back of Clara's neck stand up. "The Vance debt," the stranger said, his tone flat and unyielding. "It's paid. You can't just walk in here and—" Decker sputtered, his sophisticated veneer completely shattered by the sheer primitive audacity of the act. "That contract requires her signature for bonded labor to me." The stranger didn't look at Decker anymore. His imposing gaze shifted down to Clara. She felt pinned to her chair, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She was staring at a wild beast, a man who looked like he could tear the building down with his bare hands, yet he had just thrown a king's ransom onto a desk for a woman he didn't even know. He reached out a massive hand, his leather glove stained with old grease, and placed it flat over the contract, right beside the pile of gold. "I bought the debt," Silas Thorne said, the finality in his voice ringing through the small room like a hammer striking an anvil. "I'll take her." The town of Bitter Creek did not mourn Clara Vance's departure. If anything, the locals who dared to peek through their frosted saloon windows looked relieved that the mountain man was taking his terrifying presence elsewhere. Silas Thorne did not offer Clara his arm, nor did he offer a word of comfort as they stepped out of the magistrate's office and into the teeth of the gathering blizzard. He moved with a heavy, purposeful stride toward the livery stable, leaving Clara to struggle through the knee-deep snowdrifts in her thin leather boots. The Wyoming wind howled, slicing through her black mourning dress like a straight razor. By the time she reached the livery, she was shivering violently, her lips tinged blue. Silas had already saddled a massive, heavily muscled black draft cross for himself and was tightening the cinch on a stocky, ugly roan mare. "Mount up," Silas ordered. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her. His voice was a harsh grate against the howling wind. Clara stared at the mare. She had learned to ride side saddle in Boston on manicured paths. The roan had a heavy western stock saddle, and Clara's restrictive dress made throwing a leg over impossible without tearing the fabric. She hesitated, her pride warring with the freezing temperature. Silas let out a low, impatient exhale. He stepped toward her, his sheer size blocking the wind for a fraction of a second. Before she could protest, he gripped her by the waist with two massive gloved hands and effortlessly hoisted her into the saddle. Clara gasped as the seam of her skirt ripped, exposing her petticoats to the biting air. "Keep your head down and let the horse follow mine," he instructed, turning his back on her to swing onto his own massive beast. "If you fall off, I won't hear you over the wind. Don't fall off." It was a brutal, terrifying command. He wasn't acting like a savior who had just spent a fortune on her. He was acting like a man who had acquired a fragile piece of cargo that he now had to transport through hell. They rode out of the valley just as the blizzard struck in earnest. The world dissolved into a blinding vortex of white. The temperature plummeted so fast, Clara felt the moisture freezing on her eyelashes. The trail upward into the Wind River Range was not a road. It was a treacherous, rocky goat path that skirted the edges of sheer drop-offs. For the first hour, Clara's mind raced with panicked scenarios. Why had this feral giant bought her debt? Men like Harlan Decker wanted her for cheap labor and to steal her father's land. But a mountain trapper? She assumed she was being marched toward a life of brutal servitude, or perhaps he intended to use her to keep his cabin warm. Every horror story she had ever heard about the lawless men of the high country echoed in her ears. But as the hours ground on, the paralyzing cold drove out all thoughts of the future, leaving only the agonizing present. Her hands, clamped around the saddle horn, lost all feeling. The muscles in her thighs screamed in agony from the unaccustomed stretch of the western saddle. The snow piled on her shoulders, turning her into a frozen statue. She wanted to cry, but she knew the tears would freeze on her cheeks. She bit down on her lip until she tasted the warm, metallic tang of blood, focusing entirely on the rhythmic swaying of the roan beneath her. Suddenly, Silas's horse stopped. Clara's mare bumped into the rear of the draft horse and halted. Clara could barely lift her head. Through the swirling snow, she saw Silas dismount and trudge back toward her. This is it, she thought, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He's going to drag me off. Instead, Silas reached up and practically tore Clara's useless, snow-caked wool shawl from her shoulders. In its place, he threw a massive, heavy pelt over her head and shoulders. The smell hit her instantly. A pungent mix of wood smoke, animal musk, and old blood. It was a bear hide, lined with heavy canvas. He didn't look at her face. He just reached under the heavy fur, his calloused knuckles accidentally brushing against her frozen jaw, and pulled the thick leather ties tight beneath her chin. The warmth of the heavy hide was immediate and overwhelming. "Keep your hands under the fur," he grunted, his ice-blue eyes fixed on the buckles. He turned and marched back to his horse. He had given her his heaviest winter layer, leaving himself in only his canvas duster and a flannel shirt. Clara stared at his broad back as he climbed into his saddle. He wasn't a gentleman, and he certainly wasn't kind. But as they continued their agonizing ascent into the jagged, ice-slicked teeth of the mountain, Clara realized something that gave her a strange, jagged sliver of hope. He was not going to let her die. Dawn did not break. The blackness of the night merely diluted into a bruised, hazy gray. The blizzard had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a silence so profound it made Clara's ears ring. They broke through a dense stand of snow-laden blue spruce, and Silas finally reined his horse to a halt. Clara's mare stopped automatically, her head hanging low with exhaustion. Clara pried her eyes open, her eyelashes heavy with frost. Nestled against a sheer wall of dark granite, half buried under a massive snowdrift, was a cabin. It was a far cry from the romanticized hunting lodges Clara had read about in penny dreadfuls. It was a fortress of survival, constructed of thick, unpeeled pine logs packed tightly with dried mud and moss. The roof was pitched steeply to shed the snow, and a single narrow window thick with grime and frost stared out like a blind eye. Smoke curled sluggishly from a heavy stone chimney, the only sign of life in the frozen wasteland. Silas dismounted. His movements were stiff, his injured leg dragging slightly more than it had in town. He walked over to Clara's horse. "We're here. Get down," he rasped. Clara tried to move, but her body refused to obey. Her legs were locked in a rigid cramp, and her hands were clamped so tightly onto the saddle horn that her knuckles were white beneath her leather gloves. She looked down at him, her lips parting, but her throat was too dry to form words. Silas let out a heavy sigh, a plume of white breath in the freezing air. He didn't ask if she needed help. He stepped in close, grabbed her by the waist, and pulled her off the horse. As soon as her boots hit the snow-packed ground, her legs buckled. Silas caught her under the arms with a grunt of surprise. He wasn't gentle about it. His grip was bruisingly tight, clearly unaccustomed to handling anything fragile. Without a word, he hoisted her up, throwing her over his shoulder like a sack of grain, and carried her toward the cabin. He kicked the heavy oak door open and stepped inside, dumping her unceremoniously onto a sturdy wooden chair near the hearth. Clara gasped for air, her vision swimming as the sudden relative warmth of the cabin hit her frozen skin. She looked around, her heart sinking. The cabin was a chaotic den. The air smelled sharply of curing meat, gun oil, and old wood ash. Steel traps of varying sizes hung from the low rafters like iron teeth. A massive work table dominated one side of the room, littered with ammunition casings, lead bars, and a bullet mold. There were no bookshelves, no fine rugs, no signs of a gentleman retreating from society. It was the lair of a beast. Silas ignored her. He limped over to the hearth, grabbed a heavy iron poker, and viciously stirred the dying embers, throwing on 3 massive logs of dry birch. The fire roared to life, casting dancing orange shadows across the scarred plains of his face. He moved to a cast-iron stove, lifted a heavy pot, and poured something thick and brown into a chipped tin cup. He walked over and shoved the cup into Clara's trembling hands. "Drink," he commanded. Clara brought the cup to her lips. It was a crude venison broth, heavily salted and boiling hot. It tasted like salvation. She drank it greedily, feeling the warmth spread down her throat and into her shivering chest. While she drank, Silas stripped off his canvas duster and unbuckled the heavy gun belt strapped to his thigh, laying the Colt revolver on the table with a heavy thud. He pointed to the far corner of the single-room cabin. There, pushed against the log wall, was a narrow wooden cot topped with a mattress of stuffed pine needles and several thick wool blankets. "Take the bed," Silas said, not looking at her as he began wiping down his Sharps rifle with an oily rag. Clara froze, the tin cup halfway to her mouth. Where will you sleep?" Her voice was a cracked whisper, the first word she had spoken since the magistrate's office. Silas paused his wiping. He slowly turned his head, his ice-blue eyes locking onto hers. He read the fear in her posture, the defensive way she clutched the heavy bear hide around her shoulders. A muscle feathered in his tight jaw. Without a word, he walked to a corner, picked up a rolled canvas tarp and a single ratty wool blanket, and threw them onto the hard, dirt-packed floor directly in front of the heavy oak door. "I bought your father's debt, Miss Vance," Silas said, his voice lowering into a dangerous, gravelly register. "I didn't buy a whore. Go to sleep." He blew out the single oil lamp, plunging the cabin into the flickering dim light of the hearth fire, and lay down on the hard floor, his back to her. Clara sat in the chair for a long time, listening to the wind howl against the logs, clutching the empty tin cup. The mountain man was terrifying, crude, and deeply intimidating. But as she finally stood and moved toward the narrow cot, she realized she felt safer in this room full of guns and iron traps than she ever had in Harlan Decker's civilized town. For 5 days, the Wind River Range was locked in a whiteout. The snow piled up to the windowsills, turning the cabin into a subterranean prison. The silence between Clara and Silas was a physical weight in the small room. Silas was a man of agonizingly few words. He spent his days repairing traps, molding lead bullets, or staring into the fire with a dark, brooding intensity that made Clara want to crawl out of her own skin. He moved around her like she was an obstacle, a piece of fragile furniture he had to carefully step around. By the 5th day, Clara felt she was losing her mind. She was a Vance. She was educated, stubborn, and completely useless in this environment. She couldn't chop wood, she didn't know how to skin the hares Silas had hanging in the cold shed, and she spent most of her time huddled by the fire, nursing her bruised ego and her lingering grief. Determined to prove she wasn't entirely helpless, she decided to cook while Silas was outside digging a path to the woodpile. She found a slab of salted pork and a cast-iron skillet. She shoved 3 fresh logs into the wood stove, waited for the flames to roar, and threw the meat into the dry pan. Within minutes, the cabin was filled with thick, acrid gray smoke. Clara coughed violently, her eyes watering as she grabbed the handle of the skillet. The iron was searing hot. She yelped, dropping the heavy pan. It hit the floorboards with a crash, sending charred, smoking meat skittering across the wood. The door swung open, bringing a blast of freezing air and a furious mountain man. Silas dropped his armload of firewood, his eyes darting frantically around the smoke-filled room, his hand instantly dropping to the hunting knife at his belt. When he saw Clara coughing over the ruined meat, the tension in his massive shoulders shifted from alarm to intense irritation. He stomped across the floor, his heavy boots crushing the charred pork. He grabbed a thick rag, picked up the searing skillet, and tossed it onto the cold hearthstone. "What in God's name are you doing?" he growled, opening the window to let the freezing wind clear the smoke. "I was trying to help," Clara snapped back. Tears of frustration and pain welling in her eyes, she clutched her burned hand to her chest. "I cannot sit here and do nothing like some useless porcelain doll." Silas turned to her, his chest heaving. He looked at her flushed face, the soot smudged across her cheek, and the way she cradled her hand. He let out a long, slow breath through his nose. He walked over to her, his heavy steps making the floorboards groan. He reached out and gently, surprisingly gently, took her wrist. His hands were massive, calloused, and rough as tree bark, but his touch was steady. He inspected the red burn across her palm. "Sit," he ordered softly, pointing to the chair. He fetched a tin of pale yellow salve from a shelf and a strip of clean linen. He knelt in front of her, an awkward towering giant brought low, and began to carefully apply the ointment to her burn. "You don't cook on roaring flames, city girl," Silas murmured, his voice lacking its usual gravelly bite. "Iron holds the heat. You use the coals. Coals give you control. Flames just burn everything to ash." Clara looked down at the top of his dark, shaggy head. "I've never had to use a wood stove," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Silas finished wrapping the bandage and tied it off with deft, precise movements. "I know." He stood up and moved back to the stove, retrieving a heavy iron poker to drag the glowing red embers to the front of the firebox. "Tomorrow I'll show you how." It was a small concession, but it felt like a monumental shift. The next morning, while Silas was out checking his perimeter traps, Clara decided to clean. She swept the floorboards, stacked the scattered ammunition boxes, and decided to tackle the dusty space beneath Silas's cot. Using the handle of the broom, she pulled out a heavy brass-bound wooden crate. It was locked, but the clasp was broken. Curiosity, sharp and undeniable, overcame her manners. She flipped the lid open. There were no pelts inside, no extra ammunition or hidden whiskey. Instead, the crate was filled with leather-bound notebooks. Clara picked one up. The leather was supple, high quality, though stained with water and age. She opened it. The pages were filled with meticulous, beautiful handwriting. It wasn't a diary. They were complex diagrams, structural elevations for truss bridges, calculations for load-bearing stress on iron pilings, and detailed topographical maps of mountain ranges, drawn with the precision of a master cartographer. On the inside cover, written in an elegant sweeping script, was a name: Silas Thorne, Chief Engineer, Pennsylvania Steel and Bridge. Clara's breath hitched. She traced the ink with her unbandaged hand. The feral beast, who communicated in grunts and slept on a dirt floor, was a highly educated structural engineer. "You pry too much." Clara jumped, dropping the notebook. Silas was standing in the doorway, a brace of dead snowshoe hairs hanging from his left hand. His face was an unreadable mask of granite, but his ice-blue eyes were fixed on the open crate. Clara stood up slowly, her heart pounding. "You're an engineer." Silas walked into the room, tossing the hairs onto the work table. He didn't look at her. Was. "Why are you here, Mr. Thorne?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite her fear. "Why are you living like an animal when you can draft schematics like this? Why did you have $7,000 in raw gold in your pockets? And why, in God's name, did you spend it on me?" Silas turned his back to her, gripping the edges of the work table so hard his knuckles turned white. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the cabin was the crackle of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, stripped of its gruff armor. "Because of your father, Clara." She froze. It was the first time he had used her name. He slowly turned to face her, the jagged scar on his face stark in the morning light. "I didn't buy your debt to own you. I bought it to keep Harlan Decker from killing you the way he killed Arthur." The silence that followed Silas Thorne's declaration was absolute, broken only by the sharp, sap-popping crackle of the birch logs in the hearth. "Because of your father, Clara." Clara stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. The syllables of her name on his tongue sounded strange, heavy, and infinitely sad. For weeks she had been city girl, or simply a pronoun. Now the sudden intimacy of her name, coupled with the mention of her murdered father, sent a cold shockwave through her nervous system. "Arthur," Clara whispered, the name tasting like ash. "You knew him." Silas didn't move toward her. He remained rooted by the heavy oak work table, his massive hands gripping the edges so tightly the wood groaned in protest. He looked away, staring into the dancing flames, the jagged scar on his cheek thrown into stark, demonic relief by the firelight. "I need a drink," he rasped, his voice vibrating with an emotion he was violently trying to suppress. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out the heavy cabin door, pulling it shut behind him to brave the freezing winds on his way to the cold shed. Clara was left standing in the center of the room, her mind spinning like a deranged compass needle. "He didn't buy your debt to own you. I bought it to keep Harlan Decker from killing you the way he killed Arthur." It was too much to process. She paced the length of the small cabin, her boots thudding softly against the floorboards. She needed to think. She needed to understand the shape of the chessboard she had unwittingly been forced onto. As she passed the door, her shoulder brushed against Silas's heavy canvas duster, which he had discarded on a wooden peg earlier. The coat swung, and something heavy inside the deep right pocket struck the log wall with a dull, metallic clink. Clara stopped. A sudden, irrational chill washed over her. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and slipped her hand into the cold, grease-stained canvas pocket. Her fingers brushed against cold metal, smooth, round, and heavy. She pulled it out. The air left her lungs in a violent rush. Resting in her palm was a solid brass pocket compass. The casing was scratched and worn from years of use, but the glass face was pristine. She didn't need to open it to know what was inscribed on the inside of the lid. Her thumb traced the deeply engraved, elegant cursive letters on the back. A V, to true north. Her mother had given it to Arthur Vance on their wedding day. Her father never went anywhere without it. He had it in his vest pocket the day he rode out toward South Pass, the day he supposedly fell into the ravine. The sheriff had returned Arthur's effects to Clara, his watch, his ring, his ledger. But the compass had been missing. The sheriff claimed it must have been lost in the rocks. And now it was in the pocket of the terrifying mountain man who had miraculously appeared to buy her. A dark, horrific narrative slammed into Clara's mind, assembling itself with terrifying speed. Silas Thorne is an engineer. He knows the mountains. He had $7,000 in raw gold. He had her father's compass. What if Decker wasn't the architect of her misery? What if Decker was just a vulture picking at the bones? What if the beast standing in her cabin was the wolf who had brought her father down, stolen his gold, and then bought the daughter to ensure her silence, or worse, to satisfy some twisted, solitary guilt? Panic, cold and sharp as a butcher's knife, pierced her chest. Survival instinct, dormant beneath layers of civilized Boston breeding, suddenly roared to life. She turned toward the work table. Resting on the scarred wood, gleaming with fresh oil, was Silas's heavy Colt Navy revolver. Clara dropped the compass into her dress pocket and lunged for the gun. It was astonishingly heavy, the blue steel cold against her skin. She gripped the worn wooden handle with both hands, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She raised the barrel, aiming it directly at the door. With shaking thumbs, she pulled the hammer back. Click-clack. The mechanical sound was deafening in the quiet cabin. A moment later, the door latch lifted. The heavy oak swung open, and Silas stepped inside, a bottle of amber whiskey in his hand. A flurry of snow blew in around his broad shoulders. He stopped dead in his tracks. His ice-blue eyes dropped from her face to the heavy iron barrel leveled squarely at his chest. He didn't flinch. He didn't drop the bottle. The sheer, terrifying stillness of the man settled over the room like a physical weight. "Put it down, Clara," Silas said. His voice was not angry. It was dangerously calm, a low rumble that resonated in the floorboards. "Where did you get it?" Clara screamed, her voice breaking. She pulled the compass from her pocket and threw it onto the floor at his feet. It skittered across the woods, spinning to a halt near his snow-caked boots. "My father's compass! He had it the day he died. Did you kill him? Did you steal his gold and then buy me to ease your conscience? Give me one good reason why I shouldn't pull this trigger right now." Silas looked down at the brass instrument. A profound, weary sorrow washed over his scarred features. He slowly set the whiskey bottle on a barrel by the door and raised his massive, empty hands, showing his palms. "Because if you pull that trigger, Miss Vance, the recoil is going to break your wrist, and Harlan Decker is going to win." He took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Stop!" Clara cried, her finger tightening on the trigger. Her arms were shaking violently under the weight of the gun. "I will shoot you." "I didn't kill Arthur," Silas said softly, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering intensity. "I found him." Clara gasped, a sob tearing from her throat. "You're lying." "I found him at the bottom of the South Pass ravine," Silas continued, taking another slow step, putting his chest mere inches from the shaking muzzle of the revolver. "His horse didn't throw him, Clara. He was shot in the back, twice, with a Winchester repeater. I know because I dug the lead out of the dirt beneath him." The strength in Clara's arms began to falter. The gun dipped slightly. "I was the one who pulled his body out of the rocks." Silas's voice thickened, the gravelly tone rough with the grief he had carried alone. "I wiped the blood from his face. I took the compass because I knew the sheriff in Bitter Creek was on Decker's payroll. If I brought the body in, they would have arrested me for the murder. So I left him on the trail for the stagecoach to find, and I took the compass as proof. Proof for you." "Proof of what?" Clara choked out, the tears finally spilling over her lashes, tracing hot paths down her pale cheeks. Silas reached out, moving so smoothly and carefully it defied his massive size. He wrapped his large, calloused hand over the cylinder of the revolver, placing his thumb securely between the hammer and the firing pin. With gentle, unstoppable force, he pushed the gun down, taking it from her trembling grip. He set the weapon safely on the table and turned back to her. 3 years ago, I found a mother lode," Silas explained, his voice dropping to a quiet, intense murmur. "A seam of quartz laced with gold so thick it would make the state treasury look poor. It's deep in the Badlands, on a tract of worthless shale that nobody wanted. I couldn't file the claim myself. A man who looks like me walking into a registry office with a fortune in raw gold. I would have been dead before sunset, shot by claim jumpers." He walked over to the wooden crate he had left open earlier, reaching beneath the engineering notebooks. He pulled out a heavy, wax-sealed parchment envelope and walked back to Clara, pressing it into her hands. So I went to the only honest assayer in the Wyoming Territory, Arthur Vance. We became partners. Arthur used his own money to quietly buy the deed to the Badlands, holding it in a blind trust for us. He was supposed to finalize the federal registration the week he died. Clara stared at the heavy parchment in her hands. The seal was unbroken. "Decker found out," Silas said, the name sounding like a curse in his mouth. "Decker's syndicates don't just run cattle. They run the land registry through bribery." When Arthur refused to sign the deed over, Decker had his men ambush him. But Arthur was smart. He hid the deed. Decker couldn't find it, so he fabricated the debts to force you into his custody. Once you were his bonded servant, or his wife, he would have the legal right to seize all of your father's assets, including the claim. Clara's knees finally gave way. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal, the intricate, horrific trap Decker had built around her, crushed the breath from her lungs. She sank to the floor, her heavy mourning dress billowing around her. Silas was there instantly. He dropped to his knees, his massive frame shielding her from the drafty room. He didn't touch her, respecting her space, but his presence was a solid, unyielding wall against the terror. "I didn't go to Bitter Creek to buy a slave, Clara," Silas said fiercely, his ice-blue eyes burning with conviction. "I went to buy your life. I spent my half of the surface gold to pay Decker's fake ledgers. That deed in your hands, you own it all. You are one of the wealthiest women in the West." Clara clutched the envelope to her chest, rocking slightly. The tears flowed freely now, not just for her father, but for the sheer relief that she was not alone in the dark. She looked up at the scarred, terrifying man who had thrown away a fortune to save her. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Because you were grieving," Silas replied, his rough hand hesitantly reaching out, stopping just short of her shoulder. "And because Decker will figure out soon enough that I didn't just take his prize. I took his payday. When the spring thaw opens the passes, he will bring an army up this mountain to slaughter us both and burn this cabin to the ground." Clara stopped crying. The cold logic of survival, the very thing her father had instilled in her, clicked into place. The fear evaporated, replaced by a sudden, molten core of absolute fury. Harlan Decker had murdered her father. Harlan Decker had tried to enslave her. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, her jaw setting into a hard, unforgiving line. She looked at Silas, truly seeing him for the first time. Not as a beast, but as an iron shield. "Then, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, her voice dropping the cultured Boston lilt, taking on the hard edge of the Wyoming granite, "we had better spend the winter getting ready for a war." The Wyoming winter did not relent. It sharpened. By late January, the high valley was a frozen cathedral of towering white drifts and blue ice. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. The stifling, fearful silence had been replaced by a grim, focused energy. Clara Vance was dead. The mourning dresses had been cut up for cleaning rags. She now wore heavy canvas trousers tailored clumsily from Silas's spares, thick wool shirts, and boots stuffed with rabbit fur. Her pale, soft hands were calloused from chopping kindling and hauling water from the frozen creek. But physical conditioning was not enough, and Silas knew it. On a morning when the sky was a piercing, cloudless blue and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe, Silas pulled his massive Sharps .50-90 Buffalo rifle from its pegs above the mantel. He grabbed a heavy leather bandolier filled with brass cartridges the size of copper cigars, and tossed a thick sheepskin coat to Clara. "Outside," he ordered. Clara caught the coat, her eyes narrowing at the massive weapon in his hands. "Are we hunting?" "We are," Silas said, pushing the heavy door open against a snowdrift. "But not for meat." They waded through the knee-deep powder to a clearing behind the cabin. 50 yards away, Silas had propped a thick dead pine stump against a boulder. He stopped, his breath pluming in the freezing air, and turned to her. He held out the Sharps. "Take it." Clara reached for the rifle. The moment the weight transferred to her hands, her arms dropped. The gun was astonishingly heavy, at least 14 pounds of solid iron and dense walnut. She struggled to keep the long, octagonal barrel pointed toward the sky. "It's a Sharp's falling block," Silas explained, stepping closer. The gravel in his voice was strictly instructional, the tone of an engineer explaining a complex machine. "It fires a half-inch lead slug backed by 90 grains of black powder. It is not a gentleman's weapon. It was built to drop a 2,000-pound bison at 500 yards. Clara swallowed hard, looking from the massive weapon to the distant stump. "Silas, I can't even hold it up, let alone aim it." "You don't aim a Sharp's offhand unless you have arms like mine," he said, stepping behind her. Suddenly, Clara became acutely aware of his physical proximity. For weeks, they had maintained a careful distance in the small cabin. Now, his massive chest was mere inches from her back. She could feel the heat radiating from him through the thick layers of their coats. He smelled of pine sap, cold air, and the clean, sharp scent of masculinity. Silas reached around her. His large, rough hands covered hers on the rifle stock. "Lean forward," he murmured, his voice a low vibration right next to her ear. It sent an involuntary shiver down her spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the sub-zero temperature. "Plant your left foot," he instructed, gently nudging her boot with his own. "Wider. You need a foundation to absorb the kinetic energy. If you stand like a lady in a parlor, this rifle will break your collarbone." He guided her arms, lifting the heavy barrel. "Use the cross sticks," he said, nodding toward a Y-shaped branch he had driven into the snow. Clara rested the heavy barrel in the crook of the wood. The relief in her arms was immediate. "Now pull the hammer back to full cock," Silas instructed. Clara used both thumbs to wrench the heavy iron hammer back. It locked with a satisfying, deadly click. "Seat the stock deeply into the pocket of your shoulder. Pull it tight." Silas's hand pressed firmly against her right shoulder blade, ensuring the wood was flush against her muscle. His touch was clinical, yet possessing a heavy, grounding intimacy. "If you leave a gap, the gun gets a running start before it hits you. That's how bones shatter." Clara pressed her cheek against the freezing walnut stock, aligning the iron sights with the dark stump across the clearing. Her heart was racing. She was terrified of the weapon, but the burning memory of Harlan Decker's smug face in the magistrate's office fueled a dark, stubborn fire in her gut. "I have it," she breathed. "Don't yank the trigger," Silas whispered, stepping back just a fraction, though she could still feel his protective shadow over her. "Breathe in the cold. Let half of it out, hold it, and squeeze the trigger like you're trying to hold on to a secret." Clara followed his rhythm. She inhaled the icy air, tasting ozone and pine. She exhaled slowly. The world narrowed down to the V-notch of the rear sight, and the blade of the front sight resting perfectly center of the distant stump. She squeezed. The world exploded. A deafening, concussive roar ripped through the silent valley. A massive plume of acrid gray sulfur smoke billowed from the muzzle, temporarily blinding her. The recoil was horrific. It felt like a draft horse had kicked her squarely in the chest. The heavy brass butt plate slammed into her shoulder pocket with bruising, violent force. The sheer kinetic energy lifted Clara completely off her feet, throwing her backward into the snow. She hit the ground hard, gasping for air as the wind was knocked out of her lungs. Her shoulder pulsed with a blinding, hot agony. Before she could even cry out, Silas was there. He dropped to his knees in the snow beside her, his face pale beneath his dark beard. His large hands gently grasped her uninjured arm, pulling her into a sitting position. "Clara!" he barked, his usual calm completely shattered. "Are you all right? Let me see." Clara blinked away the tears of pain, her ears ringing violently. She looked past Silas, peering through the dissipating cloud of black powder smoke. 50 yards away, the massive pine stump had been violently splintered. A hole the size of an apple had been blown clean through the center, exposing the pale, raw wood inside. A slow, breathless laugh bubbled up in Clara's throat. She looked at Silas, her eyes shining with adrenaline and a wild, fierce triumph. "I hit it," she gasped, clutching her throbbing shoulder. "Silas! I hit it!" Silas looked from her triumphant face to the shattered stump. The panic in his ice-blue eyes slowly melted, replaced by a look of profound, stunned admiration. A slow, incredibly rare smile broke through the scarred ruins of his face, transforming him entirely. He looked young, handsome, and breathtakingly alive. "You hit it," he agreed, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't quite hide. He stood up, offering her his hand. Clara took it. He pulled her up effortlessly. She stumbled slightly, her balance thrown off by the pain in her shoulder, and pitched forward directly into his chest. Silas caught her, his massive arms wrapping around her waist on pure reflex. For a suspended moment in the freezing wilderness, they stood locked together. Clara looked up. His face was inches from hers. She could see the individual flakes of snow caught in his dark eyelashes, the pulse beating steadily at the base of his strong throat. The air between them suddenly felt thicker, charged with a magnetic, undeniable heat that melted the winter around them. Silas's eyes darkened. His gaze dropped briefly to her parted lips before snapping back to her eyes. He cleared his throat, slowly releasing his grip and stepping back, though his hands lingered on her waist a second longer than necessary. "Inside," he said gruffly, turning his face away to hide the flush creeping up his neck. "Before your shoulder stiffens." Back in the warmth of the cabin, the adrenaline faded, leaving Clara with a dull, throbbing ache that radiated down to her collarbone. She sat on the edge of the cot, wincing as she tried to shrug out of the heavy sheepskin coat. Silas walked over, carrying a tin of arnica salve and a clean cloth. His jaw was set tight. "Let me," he said quietly. He helped her ease the heavy coat off her left arm, then carefully slipped it off her injured right shoulder. Clara was left in her linen shirt. "I need to see the bruising," Silas murmured, his voice low, his eyes fixed firmly on the wall above her head. "Unbutton the collar." Clara's breath hitched. Her fingers, trembling slightly, moved to the bone buttons at her throat. She undid the first three, pulling the thick linen off her right shoulder, exposing her pale skin and the dark, angry purple bruise blossoming across her collarbone. Silas knelt before her, just as he had when she burned her hand. But this was different. The intimacy was suffocating. He dipped two rough fingers into the cooling arnica salve. "This will be cold," he warned. He pressed his fingers to her bruised skin. Clara hissed, her back arching slightly. Silas's touch was excruciatingly gentle. He worked the salve into her sore muscles with slow, rhythmic circular motions. The contrast of his rough, calloused fingertips against her soft skin sent sparks of electricity racing along her nerve endings. Clara looked down at him. She saw the intense concentration on his face, the way his jaw flexed, the sheer, tightly coiled restraint of a powerful man handling something he deemed incredibly precious. She realized with a sudden, overwhelming clarity that she trusted him. Not just with her life, not just with her father's legacy, but with herself. The terrifying beast of the mountain was the most honorable man she had ever known. Silas finished applying the salve, his hand resting heavily on her bare shoulder for a long moment. He didn't pull away. He slowly lifted his gaze, his ice-blue eyes meeting hers. The air in the cabin went still. There were no words, only the heavy, unspoken shift in gravity between them. The slow burn had finally caught fire. "It will ache for a few days," Silas whispered, his voice incredibly rough, his thumb unconsciously stroking her collarbone. "But tomorrow, we shoot again." By late February, the isolation of the Wind River Range had transformed from a terrifying cage into a profound, insulated sanctuary. The violent blizzards of the new year had finally given way to a brittle, crystalline stillness. The snow was packed so deep it buried the lower branches of the ancient pines, turning the forest into a silent labyrinth of white and shadow. Inside the cabin, the oppressive silence of their first weeks had melted away. replaced by a comfortable domestic rhythm that felt dangerous in its intimacy. Clara Vance sat at the heavy oak work table, the golden light of an oil lamp illuminating the open pages of one of Silas's leather-bound engineering journals. She traced the intricate sweeping lines of a suspension bridge schematic with her forefinger. Her hands were no longer the soft, unblemished hands of a Boston socialite. They were strong, marked with the fading yellow of old bruises and the calluses of physical labor. She wore one of Silas's oversized flannel shirts, the cuffs rolled up to her elbows, her dark hair braided loosely over one shoulder. Across the room, Silas sat near the hearth, carefully honing the edge of his heavy hunting knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic shh of steel on stone was hypnotic. Every so often, Clara would lift her eyes from the pages, her gaze drifting over the broad, heavily muscled expanse of his shoulders, the dark waves of his hair, and the rugged, scarred profile of his face. He was no longer a beast to her. He was a man of quiet, devastating depth. He was the man who had bought her life, who patiently taught her how to survive, and whose accidental, lingering touches sent wild, unfamiliar heat pooling low in her stomach. Silas paused his sharpening, tilting his head slightly. The knife went still. Clara noticed the immediate shift in his posture. His spine went rigidly straight. The relaxed domestic atmosphere vanished, replaced instantly by the lethal, coiled tension of a predator sensing a shift in the wind. "Silas?" she whispered, closing the journal. "Put the lamp out," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Clara didn't hesitate. She reached over and twisted the wick dial, plunging the cabin into the flickering dim light of the dying hearth fire. Silas set the knife on a barrel, stood up, and moved silently to the corner, where his heavy Colt revolver hung in its leather holster. He drew the weapon, the cylinder clicking softly as he checked the loads. He moved to the single frost-caked window, pressing his back against the log wall, and peered through a scratched clearing in the ice. The wind was howling outside, a low, mournful wail that usually masked all other sounds. But Silas's ears were attuned to the wilderness in a way Clara's would never be. "What is it?" Clara asked, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "A bear?" "Bears are asleep," Silas muttered, his thumb resting on the hammer of his Colt. "That's a horse, and it's carrying dead weight." A sudden heavy thud reverberated against the thick oak of the cabin door, followed by a wet, desperate scratching sound. It wasn't the sound of an animal pawing at the wood. It was the frantic clawing of human fingers. Silas gestured for Clara to move behind the heavy cast-iron stove. Once she was out of the direct line of sight from the doorway, he stepped to the heavy iron latch, leveled his revolver at chest height, and threw the door open. The freezing wind ripped into the room, swirling snow and ash into the air. A man collapsed over the threshold, falling face first onto the hard dirt and floorboards. He was a grotesque statue of ice and misery. His heavy wool coat was frozen stiff, his lips were a bruised, horrific blue, and his gloved hands were curled into rigid claws. Silas kept his gun aimed out into the swirling darkness for 3 long seconds, scanning the tree line for shadows. Seeing nothing but the storm, he slammed the door shut and threw the heavy iron bolt. Clara rushed forward, falling to her knees beside the unmoving figure. "Help me turn him over," she urged, her hands already tearing at the man's frozen collar. Silas holstered his weapon and easily flipped the man onto his back. Clara gasped, stumbling backward. It was Deputy Magistrate Miller, the man who had sat behind the desk in Bitter Creek, sweating nervously while Harlan Decker tried to legally enslave her. But Miller was unrecognizable. His face was ravaged by frostbite, the skin peeling and blackened around his nose and cheeks. More terrifyingly, the entire right side of his heavy coat was saturated with a massive frozen slab of dark blood. "He's been shot," Silas said grimly, his massive hands quickly unbuttoning the frozen layers of wool and canvas. "Through the ribs, lung shot, by the sound of his breathing." Miller let out a wet, rattling wheeze, his eyelids fluttering open. His eyes were glassy, dilated with shock and impending death. They darted wildly around the dim cabin before locking onto Silas's scarred face. "Thorn?" Miller choked out, a bubble of pink, frothy blood bursting on his cracked lips. "Save your breath, Miller," Silas ordered, looking up at Clara. "Get the hot water from the stove. Bring clean linen, quickly." Clara scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking as she grabbed the kettle and a stack of clean rags. She hurried back, pouring the steaming water into a tin basin. But as Silas pulled the deputy's shirt away from the wound, they both froze. The bullet hole was the size of a silver dollar, jagged and black, whistling faintly with every agonizing breath the man took. There was no fixing this. The cold had kept him from bleeding to death on the mountain, but the warmth of the cabin was already undoing that gruesome mercy. "Clara!" Miller wheezed, his frozen fingers weakly grasping at the hem of her trousers. "Miss Vance, I'm sorry." Clara knelt beside him, taking his freezing, bloody hand in hers. The anger she had harbored for this man dissolved into a profound, terrifying pity. "Who did this to you, deputy?" "Decker." Miller coughed violently, his back arching in agony. Blood spilled down his chin. "Decker. He found out." Silas leaned in closer, his face an impenetrable mask of granite. "Found out what?" "The deed," Miller gasped, his grip on Clara's hand tightening with the desperate strength of the dying. He tore apart Arthur's old office, smashed the floorboards, found a hidden ledger, a copy of the registry. He knows the Badlands. He knows about the gold. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The one advantage they had, Decker's ignorance of why Silas had truly bought her debt, was gone. "He figured it out," Miller continued, his voice dropping to a raw, wet whisper. "He knows you didn't buy the girl for labor, Thorn. He knows you bought her to protect the claim. He came to the office yesterday, dragged me out by my collar." "Why did he shoot you?" Silas demanded softly. "Because I couldn't do it anymore." Tears of pain and deep, crushing regret leaked from the young deputy's eyes, cutting clean tracks through the soot and blood on his face. "I looked the other way when he faked Arthur's debts. I signed the papers, but when I heard him give the order, when I heard him tell Benton to ride up here and slaughter you both," Miller swallowed hard, his chest heaving irregularly. "I stole a horse. I rode ahead to warn you. But Benton's men, they caught me near the lower pass, put a piece of lead in my ribs, left me for dead in the drifts. I crawled. I rode." Silas's jaw tightened so hard the scar on his cheek stood out in stark white relief. "How many men, Miller? How many are with Benton?" 15, Miller gasped, his eyes beginning to lose their focus, drifting toward the dark ceiling of the cabin. "Hard men. Pinkerton dropouts, killers from Cheyenne. They're heavily armed. Winchester repeaters, dynamite, and Decker is with them. He wants the deed, and he wants the girl dead." Clara stopped breathing. 15 trained killers, against one mountain man and a woman who had only learned to fire a rifle a month ago. "When will they be here?" Silas asked, his voice dead of all emotion. "The storm slowed them," Miller whispered, his voice fading away. "But the sky is clear now. They'll push through the night. They'll be here by dawn." With a final terrible shudder, Deputy Miller exhaled a long breath that smelled of copper and death. His head rolled to the side, and his eyes fixed blindly on the hearth fire. The heavy, suffocating silence returned to the cabin. Clara stared at the dead man holding her hand. The reality of the situation crashed over her like an avalanche. Harlan Decker was coming. The monster who had orchestrated her father's murder, who had tried to steal her life, was marching up the mountain to finish the job. Panic, icy and sharp, clawed at her throat. She looked up at Silas. He was standing slowly, his massive frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the room. He didn't look at the dead man. He looked at Clara. His ice-blue eyes were no longer warm or domestic. They were the cold, calculating eyes of an engineer looking at a collapsed bridge, assessing the sheer mechanics of disaster. "We have to run," Clara said, her voice tight, scrambling to her feet. "We can saddle the horses. We can head higher up the ridge, find a cave." "No," Silas interrupted, his voice eerily calm. He walked over to the wash basin and began scrubbing Miller's blood from his hands with coarse lye soap. "The snow is 4 feet deep in the upper passes. The horses would snap their legs in the dark. If we run, we leave a trench in the snow a blind man could follow. They'll track us down and shoot us in the open like dogs." He dried his hands on a towel and turned to her. "Here we have the high ground. Here we have thick timber and cover. Decker thinks he's hunting a stupid hermit and a terrified socialite." Silas walked over to a heavy, iron-bound oak chest sitting at the foot of his cot. He had kept it locked since the day Clara arrived. He pulled a heavy brass key from his pocket and threw the lid open. Clara peered inside, expecting to see gold or more ammunition. Instead, she saw tightly packed wooden boxes marked with red stenciling. "Danger. Blasting gelatin." Coils of wax-coated friction fuse lay next to heavy brass detonators. "He forgets," Silas said, pulling out a handful of the wax-papered dynamite sticks, his voice dropping to a lethal metallic register, "that before I was a ghost, I tore mountains apart for a living." He tossed a heavy canvas bandolier filled with revolver cartridges onto the table, right next to the Colt Navy. He looked at Clara, his eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering intensity. "By the time the sun rises, Clara, this valley is going to be a fortress. Are you with me?" Clara looked at the explosives, at the dead man on her floor, and finally at the scarred, indomitable man standing before her. The terror evaporated, replaced by the same molten, burning fury she had felt the day she first fired the Sharp's rifle. She walked over to the table, picked up the heavy Colt revolver, and expertly checked the cylinder. "I'm with you," she whispered, her eyes hardening into chips of flint. "Let them come." The hours before dawn stretched into an agonizing eternity. Outside, the temperature had plummeted to 20 below zero. The air was so cold it seemed to crackle, snapping the sap in the pine trees like distant gunfire. The sky was an ocean of black velvet, scattered with cold, indifferent stars. For 4 hours, Silas vanished into the freezing darkness. He moved through the chest-deep snow with the terrifying grace of an apex predator. He didn't just plant explosives. He engineered a gauntlet of death. He buried half-sticks of blasting gelatin under the crust of the snow at the narrowest choke points of the trail. He rigged tripwires using fine steel piano wire, tying them to friction caps concealed in the bark of the spruce trees. Inside the cabin, Clara worked with a frantic, methodical precision. She dragged the heavy oak work table across the floor, barricading the door. She stacked sacks of flour and dried beans against the lower half of the walls to absorb stray bullets. She laid out the ammunition, 80 rounds of heavy .50-90 brass for the Sharp's rifle, and 3 extra loaded cylinders for the Colt revolvers. When Silas finally returned, slipping through the door just before Clara pushed the final barricade into place, he looked like a demon forged from winter itself. His beard and eyebrows were crusted with white frost, and his heavy canvas duster was smeared with dark, sticky pine pitch. He smelled heavily of sulfur and raw earth. He barred the door behind him and stood in the center of the dim room, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Clara walked over to him, holding a steaming cup of chicory coffee. Her hands were steady. Silas took the cup, his cold fingers brushing against hers. He drank it in 3 long swallows, the hot liquid chasing the chill from his bones. He set the cup down and looked at her. The adrenaline and the impending violence stripped away all the barriers they had carefully maintained over the past months. There was no room left for hesitation or polite distance. Silas reached out, his massive, freezing hands gently framing Clara's face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones. She didn't flinch. She leaned into his touch, her eyes locking onto his. "Listen to me," Silas murmured, his voice dropping to a rough, desperate whisper. "I am going out into the tree line. I can do more damage from the shadows than boxed up in here. You stay away from the window until you have a clear shot. If they breach the door—" He swallowed hard, the thought causing a spasm of pure agony to cross his scarred face. "If they breach the door, you don't hesitate. You empty the Colt into the first man through, and you keep firing." "You will come back to this door," Clara said fiercely, her hands coming up to grip his thick wrists. She refused to entertain the alternative. "You promised to protect my father's legacy, Silas Thorne. You don't get to die on me now." Silas stared down at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. The fierce, unyielding strength in her eyes was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He leaned down, his forehead resting heavily against hers. "I'll come back," he swore, his breath warm against her skin. "I'll take you off this mountain, Clara. I promise." He pulled away, grabbed his lever-action Winchester repeater and his Colt, and slipped out the back window of the cabin, disappearing into the pre-dawn fog. Dawn did not break. It bled. A hazy, bruised purple light began to filter through the dense canopy of blue spruce, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. A thick, freezing mist rolled off the frozen surface of the lake, cloaking the valley floor in a ghostly, suffocating shroud. Clara crouched by the eastern loophole she had chipped out of the window shutter, the heavy Sharps rifle resting on the sill. The iron barrel was freezing against her cheek. She controlled her breathing, ignoring the dead body of Deputy Miller lying under a blanket in the corner. The first sign of the enemy was not visual, but auditory. A sharp, unnatural crack echoed off the granite cliffs, a horse throwing a steel shoe against a hidden rock. Then, out of the mist, they appeared. A loose skirmish line of 15 men moving slowly on foot, their horses left tethered further down the treacherous trail. They wore heavy buffalo coats and carried repeating rifles at their hips. At the center of the line, flanking the massive fur-clad form of Harlan Decker, was a tall, whip-thin man with a black eye patch. Benton. "Spread out!" Decker's voice bellowed through the fog, thick with arrogance and the assumption of an easy victory. "Surround the cabin. Burn the roof if you have to. Just find the girl and the deed." They were 50 yards from the tree line when the snow beneath them erupted. Silas had waited until the vanguard of the group was directly over his primary charge. From his hidden vantage point, high in the branches of a sprawling spruce tree, Silas violently yanked the friction cord. The explosion was catastrophic. A massive geyser of snow, shattered rock, and frozen earth blasted 30 feet into the freezing air. The concussive shock wave hit the cabin a second later, rattling the thick log walls and sending dust raining down from the rafters. Through her loophole, Clara saw 3 of Decker's mercenaries thrown into the air like broken rag dolls. Their screams were cut tragically short by the concussive force. Panic ripped through the posse. "Ambush! In the trees!" Benton roared, firing his Winchester blindly into the mist. "Find the bastard!" Before the mercenaries could orient themselves, the heavy rhythmic booming of Silas's Winchester echoed from the canopy. Crack, crack, crack. 2 more men dropped, clutching their chests, their blood staining the pristine snow a brilliant crimson. Silas moved like a phantom. He fired 3 shots, then swung from branch to branch, relocating before the mercenaries could pinpoint his muzzle flash. He was the ghost of Wind River, haunting the very woods the intruders sought to traverse. The hired guns were firing wildly at shadows, their bullets splintering the ancient pines and kicking up geysers of snow. Inside the cabin, Clara watched through her loophole, her finger resting lightly against the trigger of the Sharps. She saw a mercenary break away from the confusion, sprinting toward the blind side of the cabin with a lit torch of pitch-soaked rags. Clara exhaled, her breath pluming in the cold air. "Use the cross sticks. Seat the stock." She tracked the running man, leading him slightly. She squeezed the trigger. The Sharps roared, the recoil punching her shoulder with familiar brutal force. The cabin filled with acrid gray smoke. Outside, the mercenary's chest exploded outward in a spray of red. The heavy .50 caliber slug lifted him entirely off his feet, throwing him backward into a snowdrift. The torch sputtered and fizzled out in the ice. "Good shot," Clara whispered to herself, her hands shaking as she cracked the falling block action, ejecting the smoking brass casing and sliding a fresh, massive cartridge into the chamber. Outside, the battle was devolving into a chaotic, bloody skirmish. Harlan Decker, realizing his men were being systematically picked off by an unseen terror, roared in fury. "Forget the woods! Rush the cabin! Break the damn door!" Benton rallied the remaining 8 men. Realizing they were sitting ducks in the open, they charged through the knee-deep snow toward the lodge, laying down a terrifying wall of suppressing fire. Dozens of bullets slammed into the thick log walls of the cabin, splintering wood and shattering the remaining glass in the window. Clara hit the floor, covering her head as lead tore through the air above her. Seeing the men rushing the cabin, Silas abandoned his high vantage point. He dropped from the trees, a heavy hunting knife in one hand and his Colt in the other, intercepting the charge. He collided with the flank of the rushing men like a runaway locomotive. He shot one man point blank in the chest, then drove his knife into the ribs of another. But he was vastly outnumbered. Benton turned, his good eye locking onto the massive mountain man. He didn't bother to aim his rifle. He drew a long, jagged Bowie knife and lunged. Silas deflected the main thrust, but Benton was fast, fueled by adrenaline and malice. The gunfighter twisted his wrist and slashed upward, the steel tearing a deep, agonizing gash across Silas's thigh. Silas roared in pain, his leg buckling under his immense weight. He fell to one knee in the blood-stained snow. Seeing the giant down, 3 mercenaries bypassed the melee entirely. They reached the porch of the cabin and slammed their heavy boots and shoulders against the heavy oak door. Inside, Clara heard the wood splinter and groan. The barricade she had built was holding, but it wouldn't last forever. She abandoned the Sharp's rifle at the window. It was useless in close quarters. She grabbed the Colt Navy revolver from the table, cocked the hammer, and backed away until her shoulders hit the far wall. She leveled the heavy iron barrel at the center of the shaking door, her heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm. "If they breach the door, you don't hesitate." The heavy iron hinges screamed in protest. The door frame cracked. Clara braced herself, her finger tightening on the trigger, waiting for the wood to give way. The heavy oak door did not just break, it exploded inward with the agonizing shriek of tearing iron and splintering wood. The barricade of flour sacks and heavy furniture Clara had meticulously built shifted violently, a cloud of white dust billowing into the dim cabin like ghost smoke. Through the ruined doorway, silhouetted against the pale, bleeding light of the winter dawn, were 3 of Harlan Decker's hired killers. They poured over the threshold like wolves into a sheep pen, their Winchester rifles raised, their faces twisted in masks of desperate, freezing rage. Clara Vance did not scream. The terrified Boston socialite had died months ago, buried beneath the snows of the Wind River Range. In her place stood a woman forged in iron and ice. She pressed her back against the far wall, her hands gripping the heavy Colt Navy revolver. She didn't close her eyes. She leveled the heavy iron barrel directly at the center mass of the first man through the breach. "If they breach the door, you don't hesitate." Silas's command echoed in her mind, clear and absolute. Clara pulled the trigger. The boom of the .36 caliber revolver was deafening in the confined space of the cabin. The heavy lead ball caught the lead mercenary squarely in the chest. The sheer kinetic force stopped his forward momentum instantly, dropping him to the floorboards in a crumpled, lifeless heap. The second man barely had time to register the death of his comrade before Clara manually cocked the heavy hammer back and fired again. The gun bucked violently in her hands. The shot went slightly high, tearing through the man's throat. He collapsed backward onto the snowy porch, his rifle clattering uselessly against the frozen wood. The third mercenary panicked. Through the blinding, acrid cloud of black powder smoke filling the room, he fired his Winchester blindly. A bullet slammed into the log wall mere inches from Clara's head, showering her cheek with sharp, biting splinters of pine. She flinched, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine, but her hands never wavered. She thumbed the hammer back a third time, stepping out of the shadows, and fired twice in rapid succession. The heavy slugs took the man in the stomach and the shoulder, spinning him around before he crashed heavily over the ruined barricade. Silence, heavy and ringing, descended on the interior of the cabin. Clara stood frozen, her chest heaving, the smoking Colt trembling in her white-knuckled grip. Her lungs burned with the sharp scent of sulfur and copper. She had just killed 3 men in a matter of seconds, but the battle outside was not over. Through the shattered doorway, a terrifying primal roar echoed across the snowy clearing. It was Silas. Clara dropped the empty revolver, her heart leaping into her throat, and scrambled over the bodies and the flour sacks. She reached the splintered doorframe and looked out into the freezing mist. 30 yards away, the snow was painted a horrific, vibrant red. Silas was on his knees, his heavy canvas duster sliced open, blood pouring from the deep, jagged wound Benton had carved into his thigh. But Silas Thorne was not a man who died easily. Benton, the one-eyed gunfighter, stood over him, his long Bowie knife raised for a downward, executing strike. "Go to hell, mountain man," Benton spat. Silas looked up, his ice-blue eyes burning with a terrifying, demonic light. As Benton brought the knife down, Silas didn't block it. Instead, he lunged forward with explosive, impossible speed, driving his massive shoulder directly into Benton's knees. The gunfighter's legs buckled. Silas wrapped his thick arms around the man's waist, using his sheer, terrifying mass to crush Benton backward into the deep snow. The knife slashed harmlessly through the air. Silas shifted his weight, pinning the thrashing gunfighter to the ground. With a guttural snarl of exertion, Silas drove his own heavy hunting knife upward, burying the steel to the hilt beneath Benton's ribs. Benton gasped, his remaining eye going wide, and went completely still. Silas wrenched the blade free and collapsed into the snow, his breathing ragged and wet. He clutched his bleeding thigh, his immense strength finally failing him. He tried to push himself up, but his arm trembled and gave way. "Well, well, I suppose the Pinkerton agency owes me a refund." The voice was smooth, cultured, and dripping with sickening arrogance. Clara's breath caught. From the swirling fog at the edge of the tree line, Harlan Decker stepped into the clearing. He was untouched by the mud and the blood. He wore a heavy fur-lined cashmere coat, and his polished leather boots crunched softly against the crust of the snow. In his gloved right hand, he held a custom-engraved Colt peacemaker, the hammer already pulled back. He walked slowly towards Silas, stepping over the bodies of the men he had paid to die for him. "You put up a hell of a fight, Thorne," Decker said, stopping 10 feet from the fallen giant. He looked down at Silas with mild, clinical disgust. "I didn't believe Miller when he told me you were an engineer. I thought you were just a feral beast who got lucky in a creek bed. But look at this." Decker gestured to the cratered snow and the dead mercenaries. "You practically built a war here." Silas glared up at him, blood dripping from his dark beard. "You're a dead man, Decker," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Decker laughed, a cold, sharp sound that carried on the wind. "I think not. You see, the law is a matter of perspective, Thorne. When the sheriff comes up here in the spring, he'll find the tragic remains of a mountain hermit who kidnapped a respectable young woman. I'll be the grieving friend of the family who arrived too late to save her." Decker slowly raised the peacemaker, aiming it directly at Silas's forehead. "I'll peel the Badlands deed off your frozen corpse, and then I'll go inside and take care of the girl." "Harlan!" The voice rang out across the clearing, sharp, clear, and ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. Decker froze, his finger pausing on the trigger. He slowly turned his head toward the cabin. Standing in the shattered, smoking doorway was Clara Vance. She did not hold the empty revolver. Braced against the splintered door frame, resting perfectly level on the heavy wood, was Silas's massive Sharps .50-90 Buffalo rifle. The massive iron barrel was pointed squarely at Harlan Decker's chest. Decker blinked, his sophisticated facade faltering for a fraction of a second before a patronizing smirk twisted his lips. "Clara, my dear, put that cannon down before you break your delicate shoulder." You don't have the nerve." Clara looked at the man who had murdered her father. She saw the greed in his eyes, the absolute certainty of his own untouchable power. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He was looking at the girl he had tried to enslave in Bitter Creek. He didn't realize that girl was dead. Clara seated the heavy walnut stalk deeply into the pocket of her shoulder. She felt no fear. She felt only the cold mechanical precision Silas had taught her. She aligned the heavy iron sights perfectly over the center of Decker's cashmere coat. "I'll take him," Clara whispered to herself. She exhaled a plume of white breath into the freezing air. And she squeezed the trigger. The world erupted. The massive sharps bellowed with a deafening roar, spitting a 3-foot tongue of orange flame and thick, choking smoke. The recoil punched Clara backward, sending her stumbling into the cabin, but she kept her footing. Outside, the impact was catastrophic. The heavy, half-inch lead slug struck Harlan Decker with the unstoppable force of a runaway train. It shattered his ribs and lifted him entirely off his polished boots, throwing him violently backward through the air. He crashed into a deep snowdrift 10 yards away, a spray of crimson painting the pristine white snow behind him. His custom revolver fired harmlessly into the sky as it slipped from his dead fingers. Harlan Decker did not move again. The deafening echo of the gunshot rolled across the granite peaks of the Wind River Range, slowly fading into the low, mournful howl of the wind. Clara dropped the smoking rifle. Her hands were shaking violently now, the adrenaline crashing through her system like a physical weight. But the overwhelming, suffocating sense of terror that had haunted her for 6 months was gone. It had been blown out into the Wyoming sky. She stumbled out of the cabin, ignoring the cold, running awkwardly through the deep snow. Silas was still on the ground, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, awe, and profound relief. Clara dropped to her knees in the blood-stained snow beside him. She didn't care about the gore or the dirt. She threw her arms around his thick neck, burying her face in the heavy, rough canvas of his coat. Silas let out a shuddering breath, his massive arms coming up to wrap tightly around her waist. He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in her dark hair, inhaling the scent of her like it was oxygen. "It's over," Clara sobbed, the tears finally coming, hot and fast against his freezing skin. "It's over." Silas held her tighter, pressing a fierce, desperate kiss into her hair. "I've got you," he rumbled, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you, Clara." The siege was broken. The devils of Bitter Creek were dead. The mountain had claimed its bloody toll. But in the heart of the frozen wasteland, they had forged something absolutely unbreakable. The Wyoming spring did not arrive gently. It came with the violent, roaring rush of melting ice, swelling the Shoshone River until it tore trees from the banks. By early May of 1883, the suffocating white blanket that had covered the Wind River Range retreated, revealing a world of startling, vibrant green and damp, dark earth. The thaw also opened Dead Man's Pass. They did not return to Bitter Creek. Silas knew the corruption ran too deep in that town. Instead, they rode the grueling 5 days out of the mountains and straight into the bustling, rapidly industrializing city of Cheyenne, the territorial capital. Clara Vance stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the federal land office, the spring sun warm against her face. She wore a newly purchased, tailored riding habit of dark blue wool, practical, durable, but undeniably elegant. In her hands, she held a freshly stamped, legally binding federal document. The Badlands deed was officially registered in her name. The assayers in Cheyenne had taken one look at the heavy sack of quartz and gold Silas had brought down as proof, and the town had practically ground to a halt. The claim was authentic, and it was massive. Clara was no longer a penniless orphan. She was the sole proprietor of a fortune that would rival the greatest strikes in Western history. With the federal marshals presented with Decker's ledger and Silas's testimony, the remnants of the Bitter Creek Syndicate were already being dismantled. The warrants were signed. The nightmare was legally, definitively over. The heavy wooden door of the registry office swung open, and Silas stepped out into the sunlight. He had refused to buy a suit. He still wore his heavy canvas duster and his battered Stetson, though he had purchased a clean linen shirt and a new pair of denim trousers. The deep wound in his thigh had healed, leaving him with a pronounced, heavy limp that forced him to lean slightly on a carved hickory walking stick. But he still looked like a mountain moving among men. The civilized folk of Cheyenne parted around him on the boardwalk, giving him a wide, fearful berth. Silas stopped a few feet from Clara. He looked at her, truly looking at her, bathed in the sunlight of a civilized town. She looked like a queen. She belonged here, among the brick buildings, the telegraph lines, and the refined society of the East. A heavy, crushing weight settled over Silas's chest. The winter was over. The war was won. His purpose was fulfilled. "The marshals are riding out to Bitter Creek by train this afternoon," Silas said, his voice carrying its familiar gravelly rumble. He didn't meet her eyes, staring instead at the dusty street. "They'll secure your father's old house. You can go back now. Or you can take the train east, to Boston. You have the money to build a palace there if you want." Clara frowned, the joy of the moment suddenly souring. "We have the money," she corrected softly. "Half of that claim is yours, Silas. My father held it in trust for both of you." Silas shook his head, a slow, definitive movement. "I don't need it. I have enough dust saved to buy traps and powder for the next 10 years. That's all I need." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass compass. Her father's compass. He took her hand and gently pressed the cold metal into her palm, folding her fingers over it. "You're safe now, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a rough, ragged whisper. "You don't need a ghost to haunt you anymore." He let go of her hand, turned on his heel, and began limping down the boardwalk toward the livery stable where their horses were boarded. He was walking away. He was actually walking away. Clara stood frozen for exactly 3 seconds. The sheer infuriating stubbornness of the man was astounding. He could build a bridge to span a canyon. He could slaughter 15 men to protect her. But he was entirely terrified of the space between them. "Silas Thorne!" Her voice cracked like a bullwhip over the busy street. Several pedestrians stopped and stared, but Clara didn't care. She hitched up the heavy skirt of her riding habit and marched down the boardwalk after him. Silas stopped, his shoulders tensing, but he didn't turn around. Clara reached him, grabbing the heavy canvas sleeve of his duster and forcing him to face her. Her eyes were blazing with a fierce, magnificent fire. "Do you honestly think you can just buy my life? Drag me up a mountain, teach me how to shoot a buffalo rifle, and then tip your hat and walk away," she demanded, her chest heaving. Silas looked down at her, his ice-blue eyes filled with a raw, bleeding vulnerability. "Clara, look around you. This is your world. I'm a broken engineer with a ruined face who sleeps on a dirt floor. I belong in the timberline. You belong in the light." "I belong wherever I choose to be," Clara shot back, her voice shaking with emotion. She held up the federal deed, the paper that had cost her father his life and nearly cost them theirs. With a swift, violent motion, Clara grabbed the parchment with both hands and ripped it straight down the middle. The sound of tearing paper was loud in the quiet tension between them. Silas's eyes went wide. "What are you doing? Are you insane?" Clara shoved half of the torn deed directly into the center of his chest, forcing him to take it. "I am not a damsel you saved, Silas. We fought for this together. We bled for this together. I don't want a palace in Boston. I hate Boston." She stepped closer, eliminating the space between them, her face tilting up toward his. The fierce anger in her eyes melted into something infinitely deeper, something soft and burning. "I want the mountain," she whispered, her voice breaking. "And I want the man who saved me. I want the man who holds my hand when I burn it, who treats me like an equal, and who looks at me like I am the only thing in the world that matters. I love you, you stupid, stubborn giant." Silas stopped breathing, stopped, The bustling street of Cheyenne, the noise of the passing wagons, the stares of the townspeople, it all vanished. There was only Clara. He looked at the torn piece of paper in his hand, and then he looked into her eyes. The heavy, dark fortress he had built around his heart for 5 long years, finally, completely shattered. Silas dropped his hickory stick. It clattered loudly against the wooden boards. He reached out with both hands, weaving his thick fingers into her dark hair, and pulled her flush against his chest. He kissed her. It wasn't a hesitant, gentlemanly kiss. It was desperate, fierce, and possessively deep. It was the kiss of a starving man who had finally been offered a feast. Clara gasped against his lips, her hands immediately flying up to grip the lapels of his duster, pulling him even closer, returning the kiss with all the pent-up, slow-burning fire that had been building between them for 6 months. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. Silas rested his forehead against hers, a genuine, blinding smile breaking through the scarred ruins of his face. "You're going to ruin a perfectly good ledger doing things like that," he murmured, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. Clara laughed, a bright, beautiful sound that echoed in the clear spring air. "Then we'll buy a new ledger. We have the money." They rode out of Cheyenne an hour later. They didn't take the train east. They turned their horses west toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Wind River Range. They would build their empire not in the crowded, polluted cities, but in the high, untamed crags. They would build a new lodge, one with a proper floor and a massive library. The high society orphan and the scarred mountain man had forged a legacy in blood and winter ice, proving that true wealth lay not in the gold hidden in the Badlands, but in the unyielding devotion they had found in each other. And as they rode into the timberline, Silas Thorne finally left the ghost behind.